Entitled Klossowski's reading of Nietzsche, Impulses, Phantasms, and Simulacra, Stereotypes. So that's my title, and essentially what I want to do here is look at Klossowski's reading of Nietzsche in terms of essentially three sets of concepts he creates. They're his own creations, they're not really Nietzsche's language to interpret Nietzsche, which is impulses and intensities, and then the phantasm, and then simulacra, which are tied to stereotypes. So I have four sections of the paper. I'd like to announce where I'm going. On each of these concepts, impulses and intensities, then phantasm, then simulacra and stereotypes, and then a fourth section on Nietzsche's madness, just to sort of see how this worked itself out in Nietzsche himself. So let me just dive in. Klossowski describes his books on both Nietzsche and Sade as, quote, essays devoted not to ideologies, but to the physiognomies of problematic thinkers who differ greatly from each other. This emphasis on the physiognomy of thinkers reflects Nietzsche's insistence on taking the body as a guide for philosophy rather than the mind, since the body is the more accessible phenomenon, less surrounded by myth and superstition. Nietzsche writes, the body and physiology as the starting point of philosophy. Why? The phenomenon of the body is a richer, clearer, more tangible phenomenon. Belief in the body is more fundamental than belief in the soul. Klossowski himself, however, when writing of the intensive states of the impulses, frequently makes use of the term soul, which is due in part, no doubt, I think, to his interest in the theological literature of the mystics, such as Meister Eckhart or Teresa of Avila. For the mystics, the depth of the soul is something irreducible and uncreated. It eludes the exercise of the created intellect and can only be grasped negatively, negative theology of the soul, not of God. Nonetheless, if one can find a similar apophaticism or negative theology in Klossowski, it is related exclusively to the imminent and chaotic movements of the soul's intensive affects and not to the transcendence of God. What is incommunicable in the soul or in the body are its impulses, their fluctuations of intensity, their rises and falls, their manic elations, their depressive descents, which are in constant variation. Klossowski frequently employs the musical term tonality to describe these states of the soul's fluctuating intensities, their diverse tones, timbres, and changing amplitudes, which can take on various forms: aggressiveness, tolerance, intimidation, anguish, the need for solitude, forgetting of oneself, and so on. At bottom, what these impulses express are what Klossowski calls the obstinate singularity of the human soul, which is by nature non-communicable. They constitute what he calls the unexchangeable depth or the unintelligible depth of the soul. What makes every individual a singular case, or what he likes to call an idiosyncrasy, is the unique constellation of impulses of which it is constituted. For Klossowski, the term singular is opposed not to the universal, but to the gregarious, the species, what Nietzsche calls the herd, which reduces the singularity of the individual to a common denominator and expresses only what can be communicated. One of Nietzsche's most accessible descriptions of the impulses can be found in his early book, Daybreak. I just want to read this quick section. Suppose you were in the marketplace one day and we noticed someone laughing at us as we went by. This event will signify this or that to us, according to whether this or that drive happens at that moment to be at its height in us, and it will be a quite different event, according to the kind of person we are. One person will absorb it like a drop of rain. Another person will shake it from him like an insect. Another will try to pick a quarrel. Another will examine his clothing to see if there's anything about it that might give rise to laughter. Another will be led to reflect on the nature of laughter as such. Another will be glad to have involuntarily augmented the amount of cheerfulness and sunshine in the world. And in each case, Nietzsche says, a drive has gratified itself, whether it be the drive to annoyance, or to combativeness, or to reflection, or to benevolence. This drive seized that event as its prey. Why precisely this one? Because hungry and thirsty, it was lying there in wait. End of quote. This is the source of Nietzsche's doctrine, of course, of perspectivism. There are no facts, only interpretations. But what is often overlooked is that for Nietzsche, it is our impulses or drives that interpret the world, that are perspectival, not our egos or our conscious opinions or whatever. All of us, as individuals, contain within ourselves a vast confusion of contradictory drives, such that we are, as Nietzsche liked to say, multiplicities and not unities. It is not that I have a different perspective on the world than you. It is rather that each of us has multiple perspectives on the world because of the multiplicity of our drives that are often contradictory among themselves and that are therefore in a constant struggle or combat with each other. This is also where Nietzsche first developed his concept of the will to power at the level of the impulses or drives. Quote, each drive is a kind of lust to rule. Each one has its perspective that it would like to compel all the other drives to accept as a norm. End of quote. It is true that we can fight against the drives. We can struggle against the dominance of the passions. Indeed, this is one of the oldest themes in philosophy, from Platonism through Christianity. But Nietzsche asks, who exactly undertakes such a struggle against the drives? And he answers, quote, while we believe we are complaining about the vehemence of a drive, at bottom it is really one drive which is complaining about another drive. That is to say, for us to become aware that we are suffering from the vehemence of a drive presupposes the existence of another equally vehement or even more vehement drive, and that a struggle is in prospect in which our intellect is going to have to take sides. End of quote. In other words, we tend to take our predominant drive and for the moment turn it into the whole of our ego, placing all our weaker drives perspectively farther away, as if those other drives weren't me, but rather something else, something other inside me, a kind of it, which is precisely Freud's notion of the id. When we talk about the I, we are primarily indicating which drive at the moment is strongest and sovereign within us. In other words, for Nietzsche, what we call thinking, willing, and feeling are all, quote, merely a relation of these drives to each other. There is no struggle of reason against the drives, since what we call reason is, in Nietzsche's view, nothing more than a certain system of relations between various passions, a certain ordering of the drives. And I have a section here I'm going to eliminate for time, but this is Nietzsche's interpretation of religion, which Ian pointed to. What is polytheism but the expression of the drives, of the multiplicity of the drives, which then gets reduced to a singular drive in monotheism, and that's how Nietzsche interprets Christianity. This question is, if there's one God, that means one drive has become sovereign. What's that one drive? For him, it's ressentiment. But I'll move on. But the question Klossowski constantly poses about the impulses is this: what criteria of value can one apply to the impulses if we can no longer appeal to a transcendent order, as in Plato, or a transcendental subjectivity, as in Kant, or moments of an evolutionary dialectic, as in Hegel? The criteria must become internal to the impulses themselves. Which impulses are healthy? Which are expressions of morbidity or sickness? Which are singular? Which are expressions of a will to gregariousness? Which are vigorous? Which are decadent? If the impulses interpret, then the question is one of determining the type of interpretation offered by a given impulse or affect, active versus reactive, strong versus weak, healthy versus morbid, and so on. Deleuze, of course, picks up on the active versus reactive in his interpretation of Nietzsche. In Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle, Klossowski stresses the fact that Nietzsche's own valetudinary states, his illnesses, provided him with a kind of laboratory in which he could study the life of the impulses. In his letters and notes, Nietzsche provides an almost constant evaluation of the implications of his migraines and illnesses. Quote, "My nervous system is splendid in view of the immense work it has to do. It is quite sensitive, but very strong, a source of astonishment to me." Or again, a different letter, quote, "My existence is a dreadful burden. I would have rejected it long ago had I not been making the most instructive experiments in the intellectual and moral domain in just this condition of suffering and almost complete renunciation. This joyous mood, avid for knowledge, raised me to heights where I triumphed over every torture and almost all despair." But exactly what experiments was Nietzsche conducting with his own impulses? When Nietzsche experienced his migraines, Klossowski surmises, he not only found it impossible to read or even write, he also found it impossible to think. He experienced his migraines as an aggression of his organism that suspended his own thought, his own thinking. Once he recovered his faculties, he tried to describe this suspension of thought, to reflect on the functioning of the brain in relation to the other organic functions, and he began to distrust his own brain. This is Klossowski's reading. Why this distrust? The issue concerns nothing other than our experience of the unity of ourselves as subjects. What makes us experience the chaotic life of the impulses as having a unity is what Klossowski calls the phantasm of what is in French is le suppos. The word suppos is derived from the Latin suppositum, that which is placed under, and is closely linked to the terms substance, substantia, or subject, subjectum. For Klossowski, the suppos, or the self, is itself a phantasm, a complex and fragile entity that bestows a psychic and organic unity upon the moving chaos of the impulses. It does this in part through the grammatical fiction of the I think, which interprets the impulses in terms of a hierarchy of gregarious needs, both material and moral, and dissimulates itself through a network of concepts, substance, cause, identity, self, world, God, and so on, that reduces the combat of the impulses to silence. So Klossowski writes, to understand Nietzsche, it is important to see this reversal brought about by the organism. The most fragile organ it has developed, namely the brain, the nervous system, comes to dominate the body, one might say, precisely because of its very fragility. There is thus an intimate link in Nietzsche's thought between the intellect or consciousness on the one hand and language and communication on the other. Both the intellect and language are in the service of the species, gregariousness, the herd, and not in the service of the singular case, the individual. As Nietzsche writes in The Gay Science, this is quoted by Klossowski, quote, "It seems to me that the subtlety and strength of consciousness always were proportionate to a man's or animal's capacity for communication. Man, like every living being, thinks continually without knowing it. The thinking that rises to consciousness is only the smallest part of this, the most superficial and the worst part. For only this conscious thinking takes the form of words, which is to say, signs of communication. My idea is that consciousness does not really belong to man's individual existence, but rather to his social or herd nature. Fundamentally, all our actions are altogether incomparably personal, unique, and infinitely individual. There is no doubt of that. But as soon as we translate them into consciousness, they no longer seem to be. Whatever becomes conscious becomes by the same token shallow, thin, and relatively stupid. All becoming conscious involves a great and thorough corruption, falsification, reduction to superficialities, and generalization. We know, or we believe, or imagine just as much as may be useful in the interests of the human herd, the species." End of quote. Even our inner experience, that which is seemingly most personal and most immediate to us, is subject to the same falsification. This is another quote from Nietzsche, quote, "Inner experience enters our consciousness only after it has found a language the individual understands. To understand means merely to be able to express something new in the language of something old and familiar." That's Will to Power 479. In Klossowski's term, the function of language and the intellect is to convert the unconscious intensity of the impulses into a conscious intention. So that's this movement. How do you get from intensity to intention? The task Nietzsche set himself then was an almost impossible task, to think without the ego, to think not from the viewpoint of his conscious intellect, but rather from the complex viewpoint of the drives and impulses themselves. Quote, "Stop feeling oneself as this fantastic ego," Nietzsche admonished himself in one of his notebooks. Quote, "Learn gradually to jettison the supposed individual. Discover the errors of the ego. Realize that egoism is an error, but not to be understood as the opposite of altruism. That would be love of other supposed individuals. No, get beyond me and you, experience cosmically." And again, quote, What is needed is practice in seeing with other eyes, practice in seeing apart from human relations, and thus seeing objectively. So that's the first part on the impulses. So this is the second part now, phantasms as obsessional images. This brings us to the second fundamental concept of Klossowski's, the phantasm. In Klossowski, the term refers to an obsessional image produced within us by the unconscious forces of our impulsive life. The phantasm is what makes each of us a singular case. My true themes, writes Klossowski of himself, are dictated by one or more obsessional or obsidianal instincts that seek to express themselves. That's a quote. Or as he says elsewhere, I am only the seismograph of the impulses. The word phantasm comes from the Greek phantasia, meaning appearance or imagination, and was taken up in a more technical sense in psychoanalytic theory, the theory of fantasy. For Klossowski, however, a phantasm is not, as in Freud, a substitution formation. As Lyotard explains, the phantasm, quote, is not an unreality or de-reality. It is something that grips the wild turbulence of the libido, something it invents as an incandescent object, end of quote. Nietzsche himself tended to interpret the thought of the great philosophers in terms of their phantasms, that is, in terms of their dominant or sovereign impulses. Philosophers simply express the movements of their own intensive states under the guidance of their dominant impulse, what Nietzsche tended to call the will to truth or the will to knowledge. As Klossowski writes, they, that is philosophers, they claim it is a question of the truth, when at bottom it is only a question of themselves, or rather their most violent impulse is brought to light with all the impotence and innocence of a fundamental impulse. It makes itself sovereign. The philosopher is only a kind of occasion and chance through which the impulse is finally able to speak. What then did Spinoza or Kant do? Nothing but interpret their dominant impulse. But it was only the communicable part of their behavior that could be translated into their constructions. End of quote. This is not dissimilar, it seems to me, to Heidegger's claim that a philosopher thinks only one thought, in his case, of course, the thought of being, that's his phantasm, or Bergson's claim that every philosopher has one intuition, and that the vastness of a philosopher's oeuvre can be explained by the incommensurability between this intuition and the means they have at their disposal for expressing it. In itself, the phantasm is incommunicable because it is unintelligible and unspeakable, but it's because it is unintelligible and incommunicable that it is also obsessive. Unintelligibility, incommunicability, and obsession are themselves the three intensive components of Klossowski's concept of the phantasm. Now, Deleuze, I think, has provided a penetrating analysis of the nature of the phantasm in his book Proust and Signs, even though he does not use the term phantasm, notably in the context of Proust's discussions of love. Falling in love is an intensity. It's a high tonality of the soul. And our initial temptation is to seek for the meaning of that intensity, its explanation, in the object of our love, as if the beloved somehow held the secret to the intensity of our passion. But inevitably, the other person disappoints on this score, and then we then turn to ourselves to uncover the secret, thinking that perhaps the intensity was sparked simply by subjective associations we made in ourselves between the beloved and perhaps someone else, other lovers, our parents, or something else, a certain place, a certain moment that gave rise to things. But this too fails. For what lies behind our loves, behind both the objectivist temptation to think the secret is in the object of our love, or the subjectivist compensation to think it's something in our subjective associations, is precisely an incommunicable phantasm, which Proust himself called an essence rather than a phantasm, but they're the same thing. The fact is that our loves tend to repeat themselves. We fall in love with the same type. We fall into the same patterns. We seem to make the same mistakes. Our loves seem to form a series in which something is being repeated, but always with a slight difference. This something is nothing other than our phantasm, which we repeat obsessively, but which in itself remains incommunicable and continues its secret work in us, despite all our attempts to decipher it. But as Deleuze notes, this repetition given by the phantasm is never what he calls a sterile or naked repetition of a prior identity. It is always a clothed or masked repetition of a difference, a repetition that is always productive of differences. So we make the same mistakes, but every love nonetheless is different. What Klossowski calls a simulacrum, then, as we'll see, is a mask that, denouncing itself as such, traces the contours of what it dissimulates, namely the phantasm as such. Proust himself says that it is only in art that such essences or phantasms are or can be revealed, and not in the object and not in the subject. It is only in art that the time we have lost pursuing our loves can be regained and recovered. The last volume of In Search of Lost Time. Readers of Klossowski's fictions will be familiar with the phantasm that was the primary object of his own fantastic obsession, the figure of Robert, which he calls in the postface to the trilogy The Laws of Hospitality, the unique sign of his work. Since the phantasm is by nature incommunicable, the subject who submits himself to its irresistible constraint can never have done with describing it. Klossowski's narrative work is thus traversed, and I say here by a single repetition, but I think it's probably not true. There are probably multiple phantasms, as Ian was pointing out, carried along by one and the same movement. In effect, it is always the same scene that is repeated: the rape of Robert in Robert ce soir, the theatrical representations in Le Souffleur, the vision of the goddess in Diana at her bath, the description of the statue of Sainte Thérèse in the Baphomet, all articulate, in a sense, one and the same phantasm. The woman discovering the presence of her body under the gaze or the violence of a third party who, whether an angel or a demon, communicates a guilty voluptuousness. Klossowski describes the entirety of his literary output in terms of his relation to this fundamental obsession. Quote, "I am under the dictation of an image. It is the vision that demands I say everything the vision gives to me." End of quote. What then, this is his question, was Nietzsche's fundamental phantasm? This is what he asks in his book on Nietzsche. Klossowski suggests that Nietzsche's most intense phantasm, at least, was the phantasm of the eternal return. Although here again, not the only one. Greece was probably a phantasm for the young Nietzsche, and in his madness, which I'll get to in a second, there were clearly early loves like Louis Salome and Cosima Wagner, who had a kind of fantastic obsessional quality for Nietzsche as well. But Nietzsche's phantasm of the eternal return was precisely not the eternal return as one of the explicit doctrines of Nietzsche philosophy, nor even as a thought. It was rather the eternal return as a lived experience, which was revealed to Nietzsche in Sils Maria in Switzerland in August 1881 and experienced as an impulse, as an intensity, as a high tonality of the soul, and indeed as in his opinion, the highest possible intensity that a soul could have. It was with the revelation of the eternal return that Nietzsche's quest to find the highest, the most powerful affect, the healthiest and most vigorous impulse, the most affirmative affect, was fulfilled. Thoughts, writes Nietzsche, are the signs of a play and combat of affects. They always depend on these hidden roots. On this score, Klossowski emphasizes the impression of strangeness felt by both Louis Salome and Franz Overbeck, Nietzsche's closest friend, when he revealed the eternal return to them, the disturbing tone of his hoarse voice, the spectacular character of the communication. Although Nietzsche would seek numerous forms of expression for the eternal return, ethical, scientific, cosmological, and so forth, none of them were capable of expressing the fundamental incommunicability of the phantasm itself. This is why Klossowski says that the eternal return in Nietzsche is not a doctrine, but rather the simulacrum of a doctrine. Which brings, now this is the third section, brings us to the third term in Klossowski's vocabulary, the simulacrum. So what is a simulacrum? A simulacrum is a willed reproduction of a phantasm in a literary, pictorial, or plastic form that simulates this invisible agitation of the soul given in the phantasm. Klossowski writes The simulacrum, in its imitative sense, is the actualization of something in itself incommunicable and non-representable, namely the phantasm, in its obsessional constraint. So we have impulses that produce an obsessional phantasm that then get expressed in simulacrum. The term simulacrum comes from the Latin simulare, to copy, to represent, to feign, and during the late Roman Empire it referred to the statues of the gods that often lined the entrance to a city. More precisely, the simulacrum was an object that, although fabricated by humans, was the measure of the invisible power of the gods. According to Hermes Trismegistus, I don't know how you say that term, Hermes someone, artists cannot animate the statues of the gods by themselves. They have to invoke the souls of the gods. They have to seduce a demonic force through imposture in order to capture it and enclose it in the idol or the image. Simulacrum is thus a sculptural term, which Klossowski applies by extension to pictorial, verbal, and written representations. Simulacra are verbal, plastic, or written transcriptions of phantasms, artifacts which count as or are equivalent to or can be exchanged for phantasms. In Klossowski, these demonic forces no longer refer to gods and goddesses, but to impulses and affects. Or more precisely, gods and goddesses are themselves simulacra of impulses and affects. As he says, humans create gods. We create gods like we create automobiles and shampoo. In Klossowski, mimesis is not a servile imitation of the visible, but rather the simulation of the unrepresentable. For this reason, then, simulacra stand in a complex relationship to what Klossowski in his later works calls a stereotype. So this is getting something Ian was talking about. On the one hand, the invention of simulacra always presupposes a set of prior stereotypes, what Klossowski calls in Nietzsche and the Vicious Circle, quote, the code of everyday signs, which expresses the gregarious aspect of lived experience in a form already schematized by the habitual usages of feeling and thought. So it's the herd again. In this sense, the code of everyday signs necessarily inverts and falsifies the singularity of the soul's intensive movements by making them intelligible. This is a question Klossowski poses, quote, how can one give an account of an irreducible depth of sensibility, the affects and impulses and their varying intensities, except by acts that betray it? It would seem that such an irreducible depth can never be reflected on or grasped save by acts perpetuated outside of thought. In other words, unreflected or ungraspable acts. So on the other hand, then, Klossowski also speaks of what he calls a science of stereotypes, in which the stereotype, so this is his answer to this problem, by being accentuated to the point of excess, can itself bring about a critique of its own gregarious interpretation of the phantasm. This is a quote, practiced advisedly, the institutional stereotypes of syntax provoke the presence of what they circumscribe. Their circumlocutions conceal the incongruity of the phantasm, but at the same time trace the outline of its opaque physiognomy. End of quote. So Klossowski's prose is itself an example of this science of stereotypes. By his own admission, his works are written in, quote, a conventionally classical syntax that makes systematic use of the literary tenses and conjunctions of the French language, giving it a decidedly erudite, precious, and even bourgeois tone, but in an exaggerated manner that brings about its phantasmic structure. As Klossowski writes, quote, the simulacrum effectively simulates the constraint of the phantasm only by exaggerating the stereotypical schemes. To add to the stereotype and accentuate it is to bring about the obsession of which it constitutes the replica. If Klossowski has gave up writing in 1970, at least in part, it was because in attempting to express the incommunicable phantasm, he wound up preferring the eloquence of bodily gestures and images, what he calls incorporeal idioms, to the medium of words and syntax. There is but one universal language, he says, the exchange of bodies through the secret language of incorporeal signs. But whatever medium Klossowski uses, we can sense the vertiginous nature of this game between simulacra and stereotypes, which in a sense are one and the same thing, but moving back and forth between each other. If simulacra later became the object of demonology in Christian thought, it is because the simulacrum is not the opposite of the gregarious stereotype, just as the demonic is not the opposite of the divine, Satan is not the other, the pole farthest from God, the absolute antithesis, but actually something far more bewildering, namely the same, the perfect double, the exact semblance, the doppelganger, the angel of light whose deception is so complete that it is impossible to tell the imposter, Satan or Lucifer, what have you, apart from the reality, God or Christ. Just as Plato reaches the point in the Sophist, where Socrates and the Sophist are rendered indiscernible. So you can't tell the difference between God and the Satan. They're actually one and the same thing. That's why Satan is such a powerful force. He can mimic and mime and simulate God perfectly. Klossowski's concern, then, is not the problem of the other, so it's not Levinas, but rather the problem of the same. The demonic simulacrum thus stands in stark contrast to the theological symbol that one finds in people like Tillich or Eliade, which is always iconic, the analogical manifestation of a transcendent instance. Since incoherence is the law of Klossowski's universe, he who dissimulates the most is he who most resembles the invisible model. What one finds in Klossowski, then, is a kind of threefold circuit in the economy of the soul. First, there are impulses with their rises and falls in intensity, their manic elations and their depressive reductions, which have no meaning or goal whatsoever in themselves. Second, these impulses give rise to phantasms, which constitute the incommunicable depth and singularity of the individual soul, and the ego or self for all of us is a kind of phantasm that ascribes a unity to our impulsive life in the service of the species or herd. And then third, under the obsessive constraint of this phantasm, simulacra are produced, which are the reproduction or repetition of the phantasm through the exaggeration of stereotypes, which give expression, although a falsified expression, to this phantasm. So, impulses are intensities, phantasms, simulacra, stereotypes, a kind of threefold circuit that defines the soul. If Klossowski presents Nietzsche and the vicious circle then as primarily an interpretation of Nietzsche's physiognomy, it is because it attempts to follow this threefold circuit as it is expressed in Nietzsche's thought. First, he attempts to describe the impulses or intensive powers that exercise their constraint on Nietzsche, notably those associated with his valetudinary states, his migraines, his illness, all these things he was using to experiment on himself. Secondly, he identifies the various phantasms these impulses produced in him, notably the phantasm of the eternal return as the highest and most affirmative impulse of the soul. And then third, he presents an exposition of the various simulacra that Nietzsche created in order to express these phantasms, which are the concepts, doctrines, and figures of what we know as Nietzsche's philosophy, his writings. What then is the aim or goal of this threefold circuit, its intention? It's a quote, Nietzsche's unavowable project, Klossowski writes, is to act without intention, which he says, the impossible morality. The total economy of this intentionless universe creates intentional beings, us. The species man is a creation of this kind, pure chance, in which the intensity of forces is inverted into intention, which is the work of morality. The function of the simulacrum is to lead human intention back to the intensity of forces which themselves have generated this phantasm. But then what exactly does this mean? To lead human intention back to the intensity of forces. And this is the last section then, because I want to look at Nietzsche's madness then and what that means, because this is exactly the problem bound up with all this. On this question, Perhaps the most important text for me in Klossowski's book on Nietzsche is the penultimate chapter entitled The Euphoria of Turin, which examines Nietzsche's breakdown and madness through an analysis of the letters and notes that Nietzsche wrote during the week of December 31st, 1888 through January 6th, 1889, so it'll be a one-week glimpse into the madness before Nietzsche falls into silence. There are two obviously problematic readings of Nietzsche's madness. Either madness is taken to be the logical and internal outcome of Nietzsche's philosophy. If you're Nietzschean, you're going to go mad. Or else it was simply caused by an external cause, a syphilitic infection having nothing whatsoever to do with Nietzsche's philosophy as such. Klossowski, it seems to me, cuts a middle path between these two extremes. No one, he says, was more aware than Nietzsche of the tension between the incoherence of the impulses and the coherence of the subject, the suppo, that makes these impulses a property of the self. This, at least in part, is what Nietzsche meant by the famous phrase of Ecce Homo, Dionysus versus the crucified. Dionysus is the god of metamorphoses, of affirmation, who affirms the healthy and strong impulses in all their incoherence, whereas the crucified is the god of the weak, of gregariousness, of the herd, the defender of the responsible self. This is why Klossowski emphasizes the importance of Nietzsche's migraines, for it was precisely when the lucidity of Nietzsche's brain was suspended that his self would be broken down into a kind of lucidity that was much more vast but more brief, a lucidity in which these mute forces and impulses of the body were awakened. By examining these alterations in his valetudinary states, Klossowski suggests, Nietzsche was searching for a new type of cohesion between his thought and his body as a corporealizing thought. That is, the body no longer as a property of the self, but as the fortuitous locus of the impulses. Nietzsche, in other words, wanted to use his own lucidity during his migraines to penetrate into the shadows of the impulses. But how can one remain lucid if, in order to penetrate the shadows of the impulses, one must destroy the very locus of that lucidity, namely the self? For a long time, Nietzsche was content to observe this to and fro movement between the incoherence of the impulses, intensity, and the coherence of the self, intention. What then happened at Turin? It was the moment of apotheosis, where Nietzsche finally led human intention back to the intensity of forces. Nietzsche, writes Klossowski, was never more lucid than during those final days in Turin. What he was conscious of was the fact that he had ceased to be Nietzsche, that he had been, as it were, emptied of his person, his self. End of quote. Nietzsche did not suddenly lose his reason and begin to identify himself with strange personages. More precisely, Nietzsche, the professor, had lost, or perhaps even abrogated, his identity and lucidly abandoned himself to the incoherence of the impulses, each of which would now receive a proper name of its own, and no longer Nietzsche. The fact that he signed several of his letters as the crucified, that he chose the physiognomy of Christ to mask the loss of his own identity, shows the enormity of Nietzsche's ecstasy. Dionysus and the crucified were no longer in opposition, but in a tenuous equilibrium. Nietzsche's delirium, in short, passed through an entire series of intensive states in which his impulses each received various proper names, some of which designated his allies or manic rises in intensity, Prado, Lesseps, Chomby, honest criminals, these are terms from these famous last letters, while others designated his enemies or depressive falls in intensity, Caiaphas, William Bismarck, the anti-Semites, a chaos of pure oscillations that was ultimately invested by, quote, all the names of history. That's a PS to the very last letter he writes to Burckhardt. So it just becomes the entirety of all the proper names in history are invested in his own oscillating intensities. And this is something Deleuze likes to say, it's all the names of history and not, as certain psychoanalysts might say, the name of the father. So it's the opposite of that phrase. The seeming lucidity of Nietzsche's madness was attested to, curiously, by the witness of two of Nietzsche's closest friends. On January 21st, 1890, 1 year after Nietzsche's collapse in Turin, Peter Gast, Nietzsche's amanuensis, visited his friend at the asylum in Jena. He did not look very ill, Gast later wrote. I almost had the impression that his mental disturbance consists of no more than a heightening of the humorous antics he used to put on for an intimate circle of friends. He recognized me immediately, embraced and kissed me, was highly delighted to see me, and gave me his hand repeatedly, as if unable to believe I was really there. End of quote. But while going for long walks with Nietzsche every day, Gast could see that he, Nietzsche, did not want to be cured. And it's another quote. It seemed, horrible though this is, as if Nietzsche were merely feigning madness, as if he were glad for it to have ended this way. End of quote. These observations correspond with Franz Overbeck's feelings when he came to see Nietzsche a month later, in February 1890. Quote, I cannot escape the ghastly suspicion that his madness is simulated. This impression can be explained only by the experiences I have had of Nietzsche's self-concealments, his spiritual masks. But here too, I bow to facts which overrule all personal thoughts and speculations. So he goes, but I'm going to trust the doctors here, because what else could he do? Although Klossowski does not cite these observations by Gast and Overbeck, he nonetheless poses the inevitable question, where does Nietzsche's thought arrive at in this simulation of madness? Nietzsche's obsessive thought, Klossowski writes, had always been that actions, events, apparent decisions, and indeed the entire world have a completely different aspect from those they have taken on since the beginning of time in the sphere of language. Now, he, Nietzsche, saw the world beyond language. Was it the sphere of absolute muteness, or on the contrary, the sphere of absolute language? Klossowski necessarily leaves this question unanswered. We know for Nietzsche it became a kind of absolute muteness. Earlier in the book, he cites a note from the spring of 1888 in which Nietzsche exhibited a certain guardedness about his own condition that obviously waned at the end of the year. It is entitled The Most Dangerous Misunderstanding, and it concerns those who are taken to be sick or mad. Does their intoxication stem from an overfullness of life, Nietzsche asks, or from a truly pathological degeneration of the brain? How can one discern the rich type from an exhausted type? This was Nietzsche's double fear as expressed in Ecce Homo, the fear of being taken for a prophet, but also the fear of being taken for a buffoon for all eternity. In short, how can one tell if the high tonality of the Stimmung, the feeling of the eternal return, is an expression of health and overabundance, or an expression of exhaustion and sickness? This is a question derived from the paradoxical status of the doctrine of the eternal return. As a lived experience, Nietzsche initially experienced the eternal return not as a thought, but as an impulse, a Stimmung, a high tonality of the soul. As a thought, then, Klossowski insists that the eternal return can only ever be a simulacrum of a doctrine, a simulacrum of this impulse. It attempts to communicate a phantasm that is fundamentally incommunicable, and is thus a simulation and hence a perversion of the phantasm. Moreover, this paradox finds its concrete manifestation in the direct manipulation of effects by our modern industrial or capitalist organization for what is marketing or advertising, except a willed and conscious manipulation of the affects in the service of gregarious needs and wants. The flows and metamorphoses of capital and commodities, with neither aim nor goal, are a concrete form of the most malicious caricature of Nietzsche's doctrine of the eternal return. Klossowski's book, La Monnaie Vivante, living currency, like living change that we can exchange, continues his reflection on the destiny of the impulses in industrial societies and constitutes a kind of parody of political economy insofar as the modern industrial and capitalist order can itself be seen as a parody of the eternal return itself. So you get to this question, like, what exactly is happening at the level of the impulses for Nietzsche in his madness? Klossowski leaves this question necessarily open. So now a quick conclusion. Each of these concepts, impulses and intensities, phantasms, simulacra, and their stereotypes would each require more detailed analysis than we have been able to give them here. Although, I don't know why I say that. People always say that in their papers. They don't have enough time, so scratch that. Taken together, however, they point to what I take to be the primary significance of Klossowski's thought. With this circuit of impulse, phantasm, simulacrum, Klossowski has isolated the Baroque and labyrinthine logic of the simulacrum, with its complex operations of similitude, simultaneity, simulation, and dissimulation. It is something he uncovers not only in Nietzsche's Madness, which he neither condemns nor romanticizes, but also in many other writers that have commanded his attention, the Marquis de Sade and his perversions, Jonathan Swift and his disproportionate vision of Gulliver, and so on. The Klossowskian economy thus follows a kind of circle. The impulses of the soul engender phantasms, out of which are produced simulacra, which harden into stereotypes, but which in turn flow back to the originary vision, the originary pathos of the impulses. In this sense, there is no means to uncover the truth of this circuit. As Klossowski says in the Nietzsche book, quote, "If we demystify, it is only to mystify further." Right.